Bloons Card Storm has quickly become one of my most anticipated games. It's rare that a game like this comes along with new, unique strategy that can really keep a community going. A big thing in the community right now is to create fan-made cards, and I've gathered 50 from the Ninja Kiwi Discord that I think would make a good fit for Bloons Card Storm for one reason or another. These cards aren't all particularly well balanced, which is okay. We're trying to get at interesting concepts here, and each one of these cards in their own right has something never before seen to add to the table. Let's get into it. As you can see, we're doing things a little differently today. We're not doing this in the normal video essay format. I thought that for something like this I could just run through them. Those names on screen are all the people who contributed towards making these really cool cards, and let's really just get right into it. And the first thing that I want to look at, because I think that this was really overlooked, is Bloons that have abilities that help with combat. Because there's not really that many offensive cards in this game right now. And here's the first one that I want to show off, Manly Bloon. So this is 170 damage for 3 cost. That is overvalued. So normally for 3 costs would be a yellow Bloon, and this has a decent bit more HP than that. It's 25 more HP. And when you play it, you lose 3 Bloontonium. So Bloontonium is, of course, the resource that you use to do offensive abilities with your hero. So like Quincy has an ability that makes him do 30 damage to a target with 3 Bloontonium. Bloontonium is very important to collect, especially with an aggro deck, because you want to be able to defend yourself without spending actual gold to do that. This Manly Bloon card is definitely a big drawback because you don't get that, but you get to put on so much more damage that it can become worth it in the right kind of deck. This is sort of like an all-out aggro card. You do a bunch of damage, but you don't get any defense in return, and this is exactly the kind of card that an aggro deck really wants to see, because aggro needs a way to like really quickly rush down the opponent so that the pink Bloons later on can actually just finish them off in one go. Next up, we're moving on to the lead Bloon. We have this cool reimagining of it where for 1 turn it takes a lot less damage from all sources. So this of course is very punishing for a lot of the small monkeys who do like 20 damage, 30 damage in a hit, because this is negating most of that damage. It's going to be less effective against bigger monkeys like the sniper, which does 70 damage in a hit. So this is very strong on the first turns of the game where the opponent doesn't really have a good response. And because it only lasts for 1 turn, that effect, it's not completely uncounterable as well. This is another card that could definitely be seen in an aggro deck because it's very difficult to counter and it's very easy to get at least a decent amount of damage in right on turn 2, or turn 4, I guess. So next up is a little bit of a sillier idea. This is Bloon Bloon, and the idea of this is that it's sort of like a burn damage card because your opponent can't remove it completely. If they remove it completely, then it respawns with 105 health again. So what you kind of have to do if you're playing around this is you have to lower its health total as close to 0 as you can without popping it. So the cool thing about that is that it means that this will always do damage. It's always going to hurt your opponent for a little bit, and that's what I mean by it being a burn card. It's not dodgeable. So I think that's a really cool concept for like both as a finisher because your opponent can't remove it. There's no way for them to deal with it, so it's good as a way to get that final little bit of damage in if the opponent only has like 30, 40 health left, which doesn't happen all that much. But it's also effective in the early game where the opponent might not have very many monkeys out, so they don't have very many options to remove it only to a little bit of health left. So they might be forced to take a decent bit of damage. So next up we have the Cursed Bloon, and this guy is very low health for what it does. So this is sort of like the opposite of what most Bloons in the game do. Most Bloons, the more health they are, the more dangerous they are. So a Moab, of course, 450 health, you really have to take care of that right away. Meanwhile, a green Bloon you can kind of let go, and a red Bloon you can basically ignore completely. So the Cursed Bloon has very low health total, but it is of top priority. So you can sort of distract the opponent's monkeys away from focusing on your other threats. And because it's pretty cheap, only being 3 gold, which isn't the cheapest thing in the world, but you do get 3 copies of it, you can actually place a decent few of them. The reason why it's so dangerous, of course, is because it's doing direct damage to your opponent. Just 2 turns of leaving this alive, and it's already gotten enough value to be a pink Bloon. Pink Bloon, of course, is a 4-cost card, so you definitely don't want to let your opponent get that 4 gold worth of value just from leaving this Cursed Bloon on the board. Because it sticks around for 5 turns, you really have to remove it at some point, and it does a decent bit of damage for being a 3-cost card. It's just very easy to remove as well. So that'll be another interesting aggro card, especially when your opponent is also running like a bunch of yellows and cards that are sort of more health than this. It's like, do I want to take out the yellow and not take 145 damage right now? Or do I take out the Curse Bloons so that I'm not going to be taking more damage in the long run? So next up we have two sort of support Bloons, and I think that they're both really cool. So the first one is Phase, and it's a really big, expensive Moab, and the idea of it is that it can protect your other Moab. So it's not very much health for what it is. It's 7 cost and 500 health. For comparison, BFB, which is a pretty weak card, is 7 cost, 550 health. So it's 50 health less than that, and it has a really long recharge, so it's not really going face anytime soon. But it does have a quite strong effect that the other Bloons around it that have 3 or greater recharge can't be targeted. So what that means is not that you could end up going a turn without being able to attack anything. It's sort of like a less intrusive version of a taunt mechanic. So taunt would be, you have to target this Bloon. You have to kill this Bloon before killing any other Bloon. And that's not really what this is. You can either kill Phase itself and get rid of that effect, or you can focus on the Bloons that are about to go face right away. So the only thing that this really prevents is your Moabs taking damage for the first 2 turns. So it's not really game winning in that sense. I think that this would be an interesting card to pair with those longer recharge cards because they really do need the support. Phase could be a good way of actually being able to get those to last a few turns without resorting to using cards like Quick Ready, which realistically should be nerfed. We also have Purple Bloon over here, which is sort of the same gist. When we say adjacent Bloons, we just mean the one to the left and the right of it in queue, or like in front of it and behind it. Purple Bloon also serves an interesting role in that, especially against heroes like Quincy, who can do direct damage, or if Purple Bloon is next to a lot of things with somewhat long recharge. So if you have like a Moab and a Purple Bloon, they'll be right adjacent to each other because it's 4 and 3. Or you could do like Moab on one turn and Purple on the next so that they both have 3 recharge. In that situation, Purple Bloon is quite helpful because it prevents those little pings of damage that normally the opponent is able to do. Bloontonium is an extremely powerful resource in this game, and having ways to sort of mitigate that, not let the opponent take full advantage of it, is really cool, because it means that the controllers who are playing these big threats later on but don't have very much Bloontonium early on, they actually have a way to contend a little bit better, especially with all these new aggro cards that we're talking about adding. One really cool thing about both of these Bloons is that they both have pretty long delays before they attack, and they both have pretty sizable health totals as well, at least for their cost. This is cool because this is sort of the only way that we have tempo in Bloons Cards Learn. So it's very clear that there's aggro strategies where you just rush out a bunch of stuff, a bunch of Bloons, early on, try to do a bunch of damage. Then there's also control, where you're sort of building up your monkeys and defending against aggressive decks. But tempo, which is sort of this middle of the road, you're doing damage and you're developing stuff, and you're sort of like just trying to make as broad of a stat board as possible. That kind of thing doesn't really exist in the sense that it's most commonly associated with. I would say that what tempo would be in this game is developing high health Bloons that have relatively long delays, and that's sort of what this is. And these Bloons also support other Bloons around them. So this would actually make a tempo strategy possible. So this is opening up an entirely new archetype, just having these 2 cards in the game. So next up we have some more stat cards, sort of. This is Regrow Bloon, and I think it's really cool. When you draw a card, it gets plus 10 health. So by default, 80 damage for 2 cost is not particularly good. It costs 1 more than a blue, and it also has a longer delay, which in this case actually might be helpful because it means that you're able to develop it, buff it up, and send it in with other cards on the next turn. Remember, a big part of tempo is you want to swarm a bunch of very high health Bloons on the field, and even though they're not going face, because there's so many of them, the opponent can't deal with them. That's going to overwhelm them. So this is another part of that. You're giving it some extra health when you draw a card, and it sort of stays on the field a little longer so that you get extra turns to pump it up. It's kind of a priority because if you leave it on the board, it's going to get even stronger. So with all these different cards, all these different Bloons that have priority, your opponent really has to think about which one they want to remove. And that's a big dynamic that we didn't really see in the previous beta, because in the previous beta it was pretty much just attack the first thing in line, unless you have overkill damage, then attack something else so that you get more damage off. With these kinds of new Bloons that actually really want to be attacked or really don't want to be attacked, there can be a lot better of a dynamic here. Another interesting Bloon is Aggressive Bloon. I'm not entirely sure how this would work, since if you have less HP than your opponent, you're probably not aggroing very well, but it might be an interesting card to try out. I like the idea of these cards that have these conditionals where if you're behind, if you're losing, then they become more threatening. That's a cool idea, but I'm not entirely sure on the applicability of its condition. It might be interesting if it was flipped, where if you're in the lead, if you have more HP than your opponent, then it actually does that faster attack. We also have a few other cards to support our aggression, and I like this one a lot because it's a monkey. Now, we haven't really seen any aggressive monkeys that help with the aggro process, and I know that Ninja Kiwi sort of talked about not wanting to have a situation where there's monkeys attacking other monkeys, and that's fine, but I think it would make the dynamics of the game a lot more interesting if there were monkeys that were able to help your aggressive pursuit. So this is one example, Glue Gunner, which makes enemy monkeys have 5 less power. It's pretty strong, especially if you can get it out early. It'll be able to affect a lot of damage that you would have been taking throughout the entire game. And it's definitely something that could be useful in aggro decks because it's just a monkey that stays on the board. It's a permanent way to support your aggression, which is normally very temporary. Bloons are always temporary, they don't last forever. So having these permanent aggro tools would be a good way to force out things like Return to Sender. Obviously, you're not going to use Return to Sender on this card, but similar cards, a card that I don't know if this would ever exist, but like something that could remove a cheap monkey, those kinds of cards would see a lot more play if you're preventing aggression like this. On the exact same note, we also have Phases Altered Reality. This is a power. We're not playing Plants vs. Zombies Heroes. This is a power that makes all enemy monkeys a lot less powerful. Now, these are both 2-cost cards, but their utility is very different. Glue Gunner, you want to get out early so that over the course of the game, it's going to have a pretty big effect. But the power is something that you want to play later on in tandem with a rush. So that could be something like Red Bloon Storm, plus some way to buff up your Red Bloons, plus Phases Altered Reality, and now your opponent can't really deal with all these little monkeys, or all these little Bloons. You could also use it just to make your Moab go through. There's a lot of different ways to use this, and it specifically punishes people who play a lot of monkeys, so there's sort of going to be that counterplay, where if you don't want to get hurt by this, then you can start using more of your powers to remove the enemy Bloons. Or you can use your hero, but once again, with the hero, you could send that purple Bloon from earlier, which makes it so that the hero powers don't work on adjacent Bloons. There's a lot of counterplay here with rock, paper, scissors dynamics. I think that's really cool. And one last incarnation of this sort of -5 attack power on the enemy towers. This is sort of like the Glue Monkey, but it is a lot more expensive, so its use case is of course different. This is more helpful in the same way that the Phases Altered Reality would be, in that you're playing this big card that does a little nerf to everything. It's sort of another support Bloon, and it has a decent amount of damage too, so this could actually be a decent finisher. It's pretty cheap for a finisher, but it could actually get the job done, especially if you're playing it alongside other Moabs. And of course, a DDT is a Moab class, so there might be Moab strategies, and this could totally fit in with a Moab synergy sort of strategy, especially because a lot of the stronger monkeys are probably going to end up having multiple ammo, so it's going to hit them multiple times. So like Sharpshooter gets hit by 20 damage, actually, every single time it attacks. So this is actually pretty substantial. Now, some other monkeys that I think would be really cool to have, because they're sort of these evil monkeys that are attacking the other monkeys or helping their Bloons. Here's Bloon Master Alchemist, and it's sort of flipped on its head, because normally Bloon Master Alchemist turns anything up to a ZOMG into a red Bloon. This way, red Bloons get turned into something bigger. So normal red Bloons would be 190 HP, and swarm red Bloons would be 170 HP. So that's 0 cost cards that are bigger than yellow. So you're getting a lot of value there, but this is a 12 cost that doesn't really do all that much damage. It's 45 per turn, which is not good at all. That's like 2 cost value, really. You're investing a lot into this Blue Master Alchemist, but with the right synergy cards, this can be really strong. So obviously Red Bloonstorm with this is game winning. Like, that's going to be a bunch of targets, each with 190 HP. There's 8 of them. That's over 1,000 damage, but that's also a really expensive combo. But at the same time, you can use this just with normal Red Bloons. You can throw these 0-cost cards, which are normally really weak, because Red Bloons are not a very powerful card. You can support those with Bloon Master Alchemist, and suddenly these cards that used to suck are now actually pretty decent in combos. And I think that's a really good way to look at cards that are kind of not very good, is you use them in combos, and now suddenly they are good. You have to add those cards that are actually good for the combos. So Red Bloon kind of can't work on its own. Like, it's a 0-cost card. It's never going to be powerful unless it's in a combo. Like, think Puffshroom and Little Buddy from Plants vs. Zombies Heroes. Those cards would suck if there was nothing to synergize with them. It's the same thing with Red Bloons. They suck right now. They need something to synergize with. Bloon Master Alchemist would be a really cool thing to synergize it with, because you're turning these zero-cost cards into finishers. That's really cool. At the same time, we have this other guy, the Hydra Rocket Pod Gunner, and it's sort of in a similar boat, but it sort of targets something differently. So this is hurting the opponent's ability to defend rather than pumping up your own minions. So it's sort of more like glue. When it attacks, the opponent loses a Bloontonium if their passive is active, which oftentimes will make it so that they lose their passive, which is sometimes helpful for cases where, like, if a hero were to have an ability that, like, does damage to attacking Bloons, that would be useful at, like, stopping the passive. But it's also just, it's taking away a Bloontonium, it's making them lose a resource that they can defend themselves with. That's a powerful ability in its own right. Passives are kind of weird because by its nature, a passive is not something that you're interacting with very often. So having ways to interact with it, like the Hydra Rocket Pod Gunner, would actually be a really cool idea. Now, just like how you can have monkeys that help the balloons, you can also sort of do the other way around where you have balloons that are sort of support. So I have 2 trap balloons, which are basically balloons that want to be attacked. So first we have Bloontonium Bloon. This is when it's hit, you gain a Bloontonium. This is actually pretty good stats. Like, it's not amazing. 5 cost is normally 250, which is ceramics. So it's kind of weak in that regard. But if it's getting hit like 4 times, you're getting a lot of Bloontonium from that. So it's not terrible. And 125 health is not particularly low. Like, it's still definitely a threat. You definitely have to answer this. So this is sort of a card that you could run in a tempo or control strategy where your opponent sort of has to answer it, meaning that you get a bunch of points towards your Bloontonium that you can use to defend with and attack your opponent's balloons with. So it's kind of a defensive balloon in that sense, despite the fact that it is putting on pressure. We also have Electric Bloon over here, which is not that at all. It's quite offensive. This balloon is basically making it so that if a monkey hits it, they lose their remaining ammo. So you can't just hit it like 3 times with a sharpshooter. You have to hit something else 2 times and then hit it once, which isn't particularly powerful of an ability, but the important thing is that when you're forcing the opponent to play in a certain way, you have power over them. If you force them to not target the Electric Bloon and target something else, maybe you can set up a field of traps. Like, if you have 4 Electric Bloons on the board, then your opponent can't do anything if they have a bunch of things that reload a bunch. Or if you have Electric Bloons spaced out throughout the board, then a triple shot is going to be really bad against them. Also, if you have a lot of Electric Bloons spread across the board, then any monkey that has Pierce is going to be pretty bad against it. Now, to combo with these trap balloons, I think it's also good to have a card like Bomber Ace. This is actually one of my favorite design cards. Bomber Ace's gimmick is that it hits everything on both sides. So it's both a decent control option for dealing with your opponent's smaller balloons, because it can do some decent damage to their blues and their greens starting out. It's alright at that, but its much bigger strength is that you can pair it with a gold balloon on your own side, or a black balloon on your own side, and you can hit it yourself to trigger its ability faster. Now, I think Black Balloon is actually going to start drawing a card when it attacks the opponent, so it's probably not a great synergy with that. But with Gold Balloon or a Trap Balloon, like for instance the Bloontonium Bloon, Bomber Ace could actually be a really cool card. And following that same vein, we have Panic Monkey, which sort of has a similar mechanic of that it interacts with the balloons. Now this also has another interesting thing. So it gets a buff when your hero takes damage, meaning that your own cards that can damage yourself, like I assume that Azili is going to be added at some point and have a way to damage herself. Panic Monkey would activate in that kind of situation, and then it would reload faster. So this is another card where it's sort of like you're turning a bad thing into a good thing, so it's sort of like coming from behind, and then also there's synergy potential with Azili once she gets added. I think this is another cool card for those kinds of synergies. And here's another kind of interesting support balloon, the Vampire Balloon. So this is definitely not the most dangerous balloon of all time. It's 75 damage for 2 cost, which is roughly the same as a blue balloon, but for 1 more cost. You do get 3 copies of it that you can play, but your opponent still doesn't want to let it go through. These smaller balloons are generally not something that you need to focus on, but this card would actually have some applicability in the late game, because this is not something that your opponent wants to let you activate, so they're going to be using their shots on this. Next up, I want to talk about another strategy that I think is very weak in the beta, and I would really like to see become something that's very powerful, and that is spamming a bunch of low-cost monkeys all across the board, doing a bunch of damage. So that means your dart monkeys, your boomerangs, your tacks, your mortars when that gets released. These really small monkeys are cool to use because swarming is a fun strategy, but it's not particularly applicable for a few reasons. For one, you only have 5 spaces to play monkeys, so if you use all those spaces, then you can't play something bigger, and we'll get to that with a few cards down the line. But another problem is that it's often just not worth it, because the expensive monkeys are often more worth it for their cost. So Jungle Village over here is sort of there to remedy that, because this card is a way to make your other monkeys cost less. Now this card only gets value after you place 2 monkeys, which would make it so that you get plus 10 extra damage overall, and no cost difference. But once you place that 3rd monkey and that 4th monkey, you actually start to get more value. It's kind of like Cash Drop in a lot of ways, and I think it's good to compare it to that, because I've seen some people call this overpowered, when it really wouldn't be, because you have to keep in mind, Cash Drop is already 2 for 0. This is sort of like a conditional, maybe 1, at most 2 extra from the 2 that you pay for it. So it's not actually like as broken as it may look. The extra 5 damage is an important balancing act though, because just making your monkeys cost less isn't particularly helpful if all your stuff is cheap. You also need that way to make them viable. So Jungle Village sort of covers a lot of your bases there. So next up we have this power, and this is another way to sort of swarm the field with a bunch of monkeys. Filling your board with a bunch of dart monkeys is generally not particularly strong, but because you're saving the card with this, you're summoning 2 for 2 cost, but it only costs you 1 card to do it, and they also get that little extra buff for a turn. It might actually be viable in certain situations. It's also nice to just like play it, get that immediate 50 damage for 2 cost, like that's pretty decent, and then you still have those 2 guys that stick around. So I think that there is still some use with this. It's definitely not the most powerful thing ever, but if you're doing a swarm approach, or there's like a card that synergizes with you playing a lot of monkeys quickly, then this kind of card would be helpful for that. Monkeyopolis up next, and this is another really cool card. It's really important for the swarm strategy to have something like this. It gets rid of all of your friendly monkeys, and then it starts gaining gold based on the amount that it got rid of. Now, an important thing is, when you're running a swarm strategy with a bunch of monkeys, and you want to go to the late game and develop these bigger monkeys, you can't just get rid of the monkey and replace it, and that just be okay. You need to get something out of them, and this card does that. You get plus 2 more, so it's basically like it creates a farm for every monkey that gets sacrificed. This is probably a little strong. This card probably should cost a bit more, because it is actually a very substantial ability, especially when you're combining with dart monkeys and things like that. But what this sort of does is it creates 2 distinct phases of the game. You have the early game where you're swarming a bunch of stuff, and then you place Monkeyopolis, and now you're farming and placing these bigger cards. That's an interesting dynamic with Swarm, which I haven't really seen in another game. Like, usually with Swarm, you're playing a bunch of cards, and then you're either going to buff them up, or do some ability that, like, hurts the opponent for the amount of cards you have, or makes them all, like, attack directly, like, trample over your opponent. Those are the ways that you usually win with Swarm. So this is sort of an entirely new concept for winning with Swarm, so I kind of like that. And, of course, continuing that trend of getting rid of your monkeys, these are 2 other cards that could destroy monkeys. So Sell is the 0 cost one that gives you money back, and Beam Me Up gives you cards. Both of these have their own situations. I think that the cards are going to be better if you're going to continue swarming. Like, that could be used as a way to defend into aggression with playing a bunch of balloons. Sell, on the other hand, would be for that previous idea where you would get rid of your early game monkeys and replace them with big monkeys later on. So I think the use cases for these two are different, but they're both going to be helpful depending on the kind of swarm that you want to do, and that's going to increase the amount of variety that you have for swarm a lot. Now, of course, whenever you're swarming, you need to have some kind of card draw, and having monkeys that synergize with card draw is also really cool. So this is Monkey Wizard. It just reloads faster when you draw a card. You can also attack multiple times with it in turn if you're able to draw cards fast enough. So if you play a supply drop, you can immediately start attacking again with this. Otherwise, it's kind of whatever on its own. It's decently powerful. But I think that this would actually be a really good fit in these kind of early game swarm decks because card draw is going to be relevant there. Another card draw card, and this is sort of a bigger monkey that you might replace your small monkeys with, the Arcane Mastery. So once you have all this card draw in the late game, which you don't really have much of a use for anymore, like you have too many cards, now Arcane Mastery can get a bunch more value. So you put 1 or 2 of these on the field, and now you get a bunch of extra damage. So let's say you have 6 cards in your hand. This is actually a pretty substantial amount of damage that this is able to do. So these 2 cards, along with like Marketplace and Sell, would sort of make this entire archetype function. Now, there's a lot of other things to synergize with, and I think that synergizing with powers is also a really cool idea. So here's Signal Flare. When you play a power, you gain a Bloontonium. That's cool because you're able to get some extra defense out of your powers. Your powers, therefore, can be a bit more aggressive because you're gaining that defense as well. TechBot over here is sort of the opposite of that, where it's when the opponent uses a power. And this is sort of like another counterplay option. And counterplay options are very important because it makes the game more dynamic. Because being able to play every single game in the exact same way is kind of boring. I felt that a lot when I was playing like Battles 2, where it felt like the games that each player was playing was sort of just, I need to defend my side and be able to pop all the balloon types that are available, and I don't really care about what the opponent is doing with their defense. So TechBot would definitely lean into what makes a card game so special, in that your opponent actually has to play around it, and if they don't play around it, then this is a decent source of card draw. So next up we have one other card that is sort of 4 powers, and this is a pretty substantial ability. So this is going to make it so that an enemy balloon gets increased delay. Now the fact that it's random is actually very relevant, because it's not always going to be hitting those big Moabs that you really want to be pushed back. It's sometimes just going to hit some dummy cards, and that can be a strategy for the other player in that they play a bunch of dummy cards so that their big stuff doesn't get targeted as much. This would actually be a really strong synergy card with the powers, but it's very expensive at 9 cost, so I think it sort of evens itself out. Now, you probably are noticing that this is a very similar card to Crippling Sniper, which has already been shown off, and Crippling Sniper is not particularly powerful of a card, at least it doesn't look that way, and that could obviously be wrong once the game actually comes out, but Crippling Sniper doesn't look very strong. It doesn't look like it does enough for 7 cost. But there are ways to make Crippling Sniper powerful, and I'll get to one of those right here. So this is the Brewing Alchemist, and it's another one of my favorite cards. The idea behind it is that it sort of makes it so that the 2 adjacent monkeys have a 2 reload. So they're going to be reloading every 2 turns. So you can play this next to a Crippling Sniper, and it'll reload every 2 turns instead. So that's already very significant. But another interesting combo with it, and you'll sort of have to imagine this one with me, but imagine the 2 red spaces are alchemists on alternate cycles. Now, every single turn, one of them is going to reload. So the middle tower is actually going to get reloaded every single turn. So that's a really interesting combo. And because of that, this card might warrant being more expensive, but I think that having these reloader options would be really helpful for the game, because there's a lot of cards that need that. And I'm sure that cards like that will be added. This is my personal take on how that would be done. Some other support monkeys, here's Wizard Lord Phoenix, and its whole gimmick is that it supports burning. So burning is a gimmick that we've pretty much just seen with Gwen, and I think that burning is something that can totally be explored more with a lot more cards. This card sort of synergizes especially with Gwen because it makes burning deal more damage. And its main attack is also very useful for Gwen's big Firestorm ability because it means that more Bloons are going to be taking that full damage hit. This is kind of interesting because not only is it a very expensive card, but it's also a support card. So having these big expensive support cards is going to be a lot more interesting than just having this big stat card that does a bunch of damage for a high cost. And it's also going to mean that there might be more interesting play around. Like, I would be kind of okay with a Bloon that comes around that is just immune to special status effects. Like, it can't get burnt and it can't get all these other things, because I feel like there's a lot of room to make status effects that it won't be quite so silver bullety, but I think that kind of counterplay would also be interesting to see. Here's another support expensive card. This is Super Brittle, and I know I'm not the only person to have come up with this idea. Exposed in this context, by the way, just means that that Bloon takes that much extra damage every single time it's hit. So if you have, say, a Dart Monkey that hits an exposed Bloon, it will actually deal 35 damage instead of just 20 because it's exposed by 15. So this Super Brittle version is kind of inconsistent because it only reloads every 2 turns, but it does get 2 shots. I like that because it sort of makes it so that your opponent is able to sneak through a little bit. And this card also does like almost no damage at all by itself. It's only, 20 damage a turn? That's very low. So this card is definitely in need of a lot of other cards being played around it, and it's kind of exploitable. So I think it's pretty balanced, despite the fact that all Bloons taking 15 extra damage is a very substantial effect. This is sort of a high risk, high reward card, and I think that's really cool. Here's some more monkeys that sort of have that same support gimmick, but instead it's other monkeys that support it. This is Paparazzi Monkey, and it gets stronger whenever other monkeys gain power. So there's already Gwen's passive that gains power for other monkeys, and Tack Shooter, which can, obviously if it has ammo left over, it is able to become more powerful during the defensive phase. So those are 2 ways for it to gain power. I think that this card is kind of overtuned. It's a little stronger than it should be, but it definitely opens the room for a lot of strategy, and especially like giving this extra power would be a really cool strategy, because if you can pump up its ammo a lot and then also pump up its damage a lot, then it can be an unstoppable machine. So that seems really cool. Another monkey that sort of wants to be buffed is Bloonjitsu here. So this is just begging to have a power increase. It has 5 ammo. It also has Defender, which is really interesting because it means that when you're using its attacks, some of them you just want to use right away to just do damage, but if you hold some of it back, then you can get those hits in as a defender and gain the extra damage. So I think that there would actually be quite a bit of strategy to how many shots you're going to use, how many shots you're going to hold. This card both has that strategy, but also really warrants being buffed more than pretty much any other card I've seen. So I think it would make a really good inclusion in a lot of combo decks where you're trying to defend. Next up, we have another sort of support, tempo-y kind of attacker. This is Energy Blast, and it's pretty weak how it is right now. So dealing 20 damage for each military tower you control, it only gets to be the value of a pink Bloon after you have 5 military towers, which is kind of overkill. I would like to see this do 25 damage to the enemy hero instead of just 20. But this is another cool card because it gives you a way to win by developing your monkeys. Because the main problem that I think this game could have is just not having enough ways to use monkeys to win. Like, monkeys are just going to be the way to draw out the game and to make the game unfun because it takes too long to beat the opponent. You just can't break through. These are the kinds of cards where it turns monkeys into an offensive tool at the same time, and those are going to be really important. There should at least be a decent few of those when the game comes out. Here's another monkey synergy card. This is Rapid Reinforcements, which looks kind of complicated, but actually it's literally just a cash drop, but you get 1 extra money, and you can only do it on turn 4. So this is a way to get out your big monkeys really quickly. It would be really nice for control decks. This is an idea that I think also applies to normal cash drop. Cash drop being able to be played on the first turn is really powerful. Like, it's way overtuned. And the way that you change that is you make it so it gives you more money, but it costs something to play. So this card is a 4 cost, you effectively gain 7. But what that really means is it's a 0 cost, gain 3. Cash Drop could totally work completely fine as a 3 cost, gain 5. Like, that would be a lot more balanced than what it is right now, because as is, you can play it and get a farm out, or play 2 of them and get a farm out. There's a lot of different ways to really take advantage of that early cash drop that it really substantially influences the game. I think that there is going to be some counterplay with the Return to Sender card, which is sort of able to get rid of the cheated out card, plus it sort of diminishes the value of the cheats. But Cash Drop definitely does need that little bit of a nerf where it doesn't lose efficiency, but you just can't play it so soon. This is another ramp-based card. This is devaluing Bloon, and to me, it reminds me a lot of Trickster from Plants vs. Zombies Heroes, which is one of the coolest cards in the game. So Trickster is, if you've played Plants vs. Zombies Heroes, you've probably been destroyed by it. It's a very fun strategy to just swarm a bunch of tricks on the opponent and control them, and then when you're done with all that, you can play it and it does a bunch of damage. This card is also like pretty decent damage. It's sort of like a mini Moab, but you can get it down to like maybe 4 cost and play it, and it's pretty decent value at that. It's actually very strong at 4. So I think that having a card more similar to Trickster, where it rushes out the damage very quickly, is also interesting, but having this actually have that counterplay of it has 3 delay means that it's less annoying when you lose to it. So having a card like this in the game would be probably not particularly annoying, but also have a lot of strategy around it, because you put 3 of these in your deck, you have it in your hand, and you just swarm a bunch of Bloons, and when they pop, it can be developed. So in that kind of deck, you're playing low health Bloons, like red Bloons and blue Bloons, which is kind of not what aggro is generally going to be. Aggro is mostly going to be like you have your, maybe you like start swarming on turn 2 and 3 and 4, and you're playing these bigger stat cards rather than a lot of stat cards. So that's going to be another different approach to the strategy. So this is another like very big card, and it's kind of interesting in the sense that if it has all its ammo, it does a bunch of damage, but you can use its ammo to hit one target a bunch and do a lot of damage. So it's sort of like a combination of single target and splash damage all in one card. I think that's kind of interesting. This is another kind of big card, and I feel like it could be more interesting if it was more expensive, but could target any kind of Bloon. But the idea behind this card is that you can sort of misdirect the bigger, like the ceramics, onto your side and like turn their 250 damage on you into 125 damage on them. This dynamic of it having the HP of it makes it a lot more balanced. It makes it so that you can't just turn your opponent's entire offensive momentum onto them, but it is something that the opponent definitely needs to play around. And having these cards that you need to play around that aren't completely game breaking, because obviously with this you can just play another Bloon. Like, it has 4 reloads, so you can't just spam it. But there is this interesting dynamic where you have to sort of either play around it, or like send in a decoy Bloon that it takes. And then if you're playing with this, then it's also like really cool because you can sort of create an offensive push without even playing any Bloons. This is another card that sort of has a similar gimmick, but it doesn't switch the side. So this is Fragility, and it's sort of a big removal card. It's not very powerful on the smaller stuff, but it's an effective way of dealing with like Moabs and BFBs. I think that having a card like this is good. I know that some people like kind of complain about these kind of cards as being sort of silver bullety because it's not very powerful against Swarm, but importantly, it's still playable against Swarm. It's not like it's destroy a Moab or do a bunch of damage to a Moab. It's damage a Bloon for half of its health. So that's not actually like that silver bullety anymore, because at least you can play it in other situations. So there's a big difference there, and having removal cards like this I think is a really good idea. I think that powers should have more removal options. Like right now we just have Return to Sender. It's kind of basic, like almost all the removal is being done by monkeys. Having these other powers that can do that would mean that you have more strategy, especially with cards that can synergize with powers. Here's 2 other removal options with powers, and both of them are sort of these overstatted cards that have a downside attached to them. So the first one is you have to destroy one of your allied Bloons, and the second one is that you lose all your Bloontonium. But both of them have these really powerful field clear effects that are both based on the thing that you sacrifice. So I think both of these cards are quite interesting. I checked the numbers and they don't seem particularly overpowered. I could be wrong there, but it doesn't look like these cards are actually going to be that substantial. Rocket Storm might actually be a little weak. I think that Bloon Explosion might actually be okay, because in order to get the value of a double Firestorm, you kind of need to have that bigger yellow Bloon, which costs 3, so you're spending 5 to do 2 Firestorms. It's a little strong, and Bloon Explosion could probably cost 3, but it seems relatively balanced to me. Here's another card that sort of has a status effect attached to it. So we were talking about Taunt earlier. I think that Taunt is a really good mechanic for this game. Forcing the player to play their monkeys attacking certain targets. That's going to be a really cool way to get your offensive push through. Dread Bloon's Armory is just a way of doing that. You give a Bloon some Taunt, you give it extra HP, not so that it can go face, but so that it can withstand a few more hits and not let the opponent break through. Another interesting thing with this card is you can play it right next to a trap Bloon, like Golden, and the monkeys will have to hit it and then also hit the Golden Bloon next to it. Or you can just put it on a Golden Bloon itself. There will definitely be some interesting synergy with this. Here's another one that's kind of interesting. This is sort of just making your big minions have a little bit more staying power. You can put this on just the biggest of Bloons, like BFBs or maybe ZOMGs when those get added. I really like the idea of just giving these massive stat buff cards to your opponent and just saying, deal with this. And then Lich's Blessing is sort of a way to influence the board after you've developed all these big stat cards. It can get a pretty decent amount of value depending on what it's able to target, because it is only 3 costs. So if it targets a BFB, then it actually gets something like 170 just ballpark extra damage, which is pretty good for 3 costs. This card's probably a little slow, and it might want to draw a card as well, but it seems pretty cool. So the next few monkeys that we're going to be looking at are sort of just interesting cards with abilities that mean you actually have to think about them. Not necessarily particularly synergetic, but first up we have Dartling Gunner. And this one means that the order that you use your ammo is actually quite relevant. So the first attack is less damage than the second one, third one, fourth one. So you just have to give it a little bit more thought and do some quick math in your head. This monkey, of course, is not particularly interesting for increasing the synergy of the game, but it is more interesting than the kinds of finishers that we have right now. You actually have to put a little bit more thought into it. I think having cards like this is a lot more interesting than having stuff like Super Monkey, which is just doing damage just plainly. Next up we have Dual Layer Blades, and this is also kind of interesting because it doesn't have particularly much damage. It has the same stats as a crossbow basically. It gets extra power if it actually pops something. So your opponent's play around could just be putting higher health targets on the board. And the way that you sort of support this card is you sort of help it out by doing damage to weaken a Bloon, and then you hit a Bloon to kill it with this, and you might be a little bit overkill, but now your second shot that turn is going to do 70 damage, you get a lot more value. Next up we have Taxpayer, and this is another card with just a lot of ammo. So there's always interesting stuff to do with a lot of ammo. This one has a special ability where it gains extra ammo when it pops an attacking Bloon. So what you kind of want to do with this one is you want to use as few ammo as possible to weaken all the Bloons that are coming in this turn. And then every single time it hits one of them, it'll gain an extra ammo, hit the next one, gain an extra ammo, hit the next one. That's going to be a pretty hard combo to pull off, especially when it only does 25 damage, but it would be really cool to pull off a nice chain of that going. Next up is this card, which is kind of weird, but the idea of this one is that it is specifically designed to target the Bloons that are about to attack. So this is sort of double-sided. First of all, your Moabs, the Moabs on the opponent's side, are probably going to have more delay on average than the little Bloons. So you want to get your value on those big Moabs. So there's sort of a strategy to waiting, not using the attack the turn that it comes off cooldown. You wait a turn so you can get even more damage in the next turn. I think that's a really cool dynamic because as of now, there's pretty much no reason not to use your ammo. I could even see this being reworked to be 150 damage with 2 shots. That way, maybe you want to use the first shot and then you hold on the other one, so you're not reloading, you're not getting that reload, which is just like, it's madness in Bloons Card Storm. Like, you always want to use all of your shots if you're using any of them. This card would actually be different, so it creates that new dynamic. This is another interesting one, and it's one of the last cards we have left. This is Transforming Tonic, and it's Monster. So the idea of this card is that it's really powerful for 2 turns, because it immediately becomes a transformed monster, can do a lot of damage really quick, and then after that, it just sucks. It sticks on the field doing almost no damage, which is kind of interesting, because the way that you would use this card is as a, I guess, like a removal that's instant. You can instantly do a bunch of damage. It's kind of like a get out of jail free card, but it costs a lot. So it doesn't really play much like another monkey. It plays more like a power, but it lasts for 2 turns, sort of. So it's kind of got its own thing, where it's a 2-turn duration power type card. Next up, we have our last balloon for the list, and this is Poisonous Balloon. I don't think that this is balanced at all. I think that it's really swingy with taking 200 damage, because that 200 damage is going to the player versus like all this 7 Bloontonium extra that you're getting. I think it's kind of too swingy for that, but there is something really cool about the dynamic of you play this card that gives you a lot of support, this balloon. Now you need to keep it alive for 3 turns too. So the whole gimmick of this card is that you have to preserve it as much as possible, because it's very easy for your opponent to just remove it if they're really trying. And this is a very high priority target, doing 200 damage. So you can synergize this with Taunt, things like that. This card would be hard to use right, but if you're able to pull it off, it can actually get a lot of value. So I would say it should probably be scaled down to, you take less damage, but it also gives you less Bloontonium. But I think this is a really cool idea for a dynamic, like preserve the balloon as much as possible, because if it dies, then you're screwed. And the last card on the list is kind of a joke. I think this is a good idea. I think that this would belong in the game. I think it's really good to have a card like this, where it's just this big transforming RNG fest. I think this would be fun. I think it's kind of undercosted. Like, a card like this should not be competitive, and if it even hits 2 monkeys that are pretty cheap, you're getting a lot of value for that. This card could probably cost like 20, honestly. So you have to like sort of wait a turn. I think that could be a really interesting dynamic. I don't know, this card just seems fun to me. It's the last card on the list because it's kind of a goof. Come on, I mean, this would be fun for the ranked mode, right? Like, come on.